One thing I really took note of after the audience learns more about you and your story is just how
Mhm.
calm and graceful you are. You seem to have a pretty great deal of patience, and we can also just see very subtle ways of you being touched by people's stories throughout, such
Mm.
as when you sit down with Gary and Chris, like Gary talks about his accident and how it changed his life.
Mhm.
And I'm curious through all the conversations you've had with people who you've worked with, and you've probably heard some really amazing and touching stories. How do you balance professionalism with your own humanity? Because I was a
Mm.
crying mess by the end of this, and you just kind of want to hug all these people.
Yeah, buddy, it's a good question, Preston. It's funny work this way. You sign up for a sort of a distortion in a sense, a distorted view in that you're hanging out perhaps disproportionately with suffering. You're hanging out disproportionately with death, with loss. And so I kind of take a literal view on it. And so if I'm going to be around that stuff a lot, I need to make sure to find time to be, you know, just out in the woods alone or with animals, not in a wordless, not in a, not in a wordy place. So, so part of your question gets at sort of self care, which is a real issue for people in my field and healthcare in general. It's not, so I'll just say it's a tricky thing. It's a work in progress. Sometimes I feel a little numbed out and a little scarred down, like I should be feeling things I'm not feeling. And sometimes I feel kind of hypersensitive.
Mm,
And you just kind of strap in for a different kind of rhythm. If whether you're there or not to hear someone's story, they're still having struggles. They're still having triumphs.
right.
These are all happening all the time, whether I'm in front of their story with them or not. So it's also kind of a worldview that these things are happening all the time, and it feels in some ways better to be near those problems or near those issues than farther away. It feels more comfortable to know I'm closer into these things. And then lastly, I think the biggest answer to your question, Preston, is like, you get to a point where like I said, sadness isn't, sorrow, tears, these are not your enemy. These You just kind of make peace with sadness as part of the rhythm of life. And so if you stay closer to that truth, then you're less thrown around by it. So in
Right.
this way, this kind of work can also help you if you stay with it. It can bury you, or it can help you stay in this very sensitive but knowing place where you're
Mhm.
not surprised by heartache, but you're still moved by it. And that's the zone I like to find myself in if I can. Like I say, sometimes you go numb and sometimes you go hypersensitive, but over time you find your balance.
I know that the goal of this was for Chris Hemsworth to understand more about aging and mortality as well as the audience. But how often do people's telling of their journeys to you unlock a new discovery about yourself and your own journey with aging and mortality? Did this
Mm.
project reveal anything new, or did it just kind of cement views and truths you already knew and believed?
By now let's think here. Let me see if I want to give you a thoughtful answer. In so many ways, human experience, life in general, probably are variations on themes, and whether no matter what age or period we live in, or how old you are, or what culture you come from, there are probably some, if we cared to, we could probably name a handful of zones
Mm,
where all human experience is kind of falls into place, and I don't know that in the broad strokes, it's been a while since I've learned anything, something new, huge. But what you instead of stumbling into something that feels like wholly new territory, you more dwell in the endless variations, practically speaking, the infinite variations on these themes. So I can still find myself reminded of things like being with Chris and that whole experience. It's a reminder, like none of us, myself included, it's impossible to not take life for granted in some level, in some way.
yeah.
If you talk to someone who's truly enlightened, maybe you'd get a different story, but so for me, it's just more not that I'm finding new zones, but new combinations. new reminders that, oh yeah, right, I'm taking tomorrow for granted. I fall into that too. I don't know, I may not get to tomorrow. I need to be reminded of those things. So they're not new per se, but I have an endless need to be reminded of these things, and an endless curiosity just to see the panoply, the like I say, the variations on themes play out. Those are just fascinating and interesting, even if you know where the story's going. You know, it's really not so much about the endpoint, because as part of the lesson here is the endpoint's pretty, we know what's going to happen to us. We will die. You know, that the end is revealed in some way. How we'll get there, how we'll feel on our way, that's where all the variation comes, and that's where all the intrigue is. So does that make sense? Am I talking some sense?
Yeah, I hear you. We meet so many incredible people throughout this journey, and I mentioned Gary, but there's Natalie, and there's your colleague and friend Alua Arthur. How did you come to meet these people yourself, and how does someone like Miss Arthur and her knowledge challenge you in your thinking?
Well, so everyone I met in the film, these were folks who the casting guys found. I wasn't out in the world finding them per se. So I met them through the filming process. And we didn't have a lot of time together before there was a camera in our, on site in our view. But the crew did such a wonderful job of creating this sort of alternative world where you could kind of inhabit and quickly feel a sort of kinship with folks who were in this project, in this sort of created space. So even though we're sort of just meeting each other first time, we could go pretty deep pretty quickly. And also folks who step forward, like Gary, like Natalie, to do work, these guys, they know themselves very well. And so you can quickly, when you're talking with someone who knows themselves, you're not stumbling over denials and things that you have to really tiptoe around. These guys have put their hands up to say, hey, I'm looking at my mortality, let's talk about it. So it was much easier to sink into a pretty deep zone with them. That's your question about Ilua. Ilua's awesome. I mean, and she represents, in her work as a death doula, that is in some ways ancient work, and in some ways sort of newfangled creation. And there's a lot to love about that work. And there's a lot to invite. And I, as a physician in the medical world, I'm so grateful that these other models of care are coming around, because Lord knows the medical model is not going to reach everybody. And even if it reached everybody, it would reach only part of people. A lot of medical stuff reduces people in ways that isn't helpful. And there's problems with the medical model. So for so many reasons, I'm thrilled to see a death doula movement. I'm thrilled where people are finding their way to the bedside one way or another. So that's all great news. Where it's a little challenging is sort of structurally. I think a lot of doula work is, you can get training pretty quickly and find yourself at the bedside with people. And this is very, depending how far you want to go with people, this is very nuanced work. And especially if you're using yourself as a tool, a therapeutic agent, your own life's experiences, your own training, this many years to get to a place of real deep competence. But competence to what end? Competence to be with someone and get them a drink of water and not run away, competence to prescribe medications. There's all these different skill sets that go along with this work. So I guess in answer to your question, it's it's mostly wonderful for me that Alua's success is wonderful for me, and Death Doula's ascent is wonderful. And I can also feel where there's turf wars. There's a lot of folks in the social sciences and the doula world would easily tell you how horrible medicine is and healthcare is, but not really appreciate why it's that way and all the good that comes from medicine. So to get to these layers of nuance and understanding takes a lot of time. And sometimes I'll meet folks who are pretty green, sort of saying, hey, I'm a doula, I can be at the bedside, I can do all sorts of things. It's like, and there's some room for experience and other skill sets here, and don't just dump on doctors. They're doing a lot of things that you don't see. And so this is sort of a challenge for me, not with Alua, we're buddies, but in these structural ways, how does medicine dovetail with doulas in a way that's competent and mutually beneficial for everybody without competing? And that stuff has to be worked out at the level of the systems and structures, et cetera. And we're pretty early on in that process. I know a lot of doctors would tell you doulas suck. I know a lot of doulas would tell you doctors suck, and that's mostly born in both directions from a lack of understanding.
Yeah. I know we're just about out of time, so I'll cut you loose on this. As well as this documentary immerses me into the experience of what it would be like to be in Chris's shoes, is there something I would never know unless I went through this experiment myself and had those heart-to-heart conversations like he did?
I think there's, on paper, I've written curricula, I've written a book on this. I mean, you and I could sit down and on paper, make sure that you, like I was saying earlier, those variations on themes, make sure you know all the themes. And you could intellectually get there as a thoughtful, sensitive person. And with empathy for yourself and others, you can get to a pretty full sense of what goes into this thing called dying. But that is importantly different for what it feels like to actually be experiencing these things. So you could quickly know the outline, the bullet points, but what it feels like to be in these shoes or to work with someone in these shoes, those are layers upon layers that the experience needs to bring to you. So even, of course, there are limits in Chris's exercise. That was a fabricated exercise and it took him deep. You see it, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Does that get him all the way? Does that really prepare him to know what it's going to feel like when he's actually on his deathbed? Probably not, in terms of the feelings, the experience of it. For myself, I've been around people, thousands of people who have died, and I can get real close through my empathy, through my own witnessing, but I'm also certain, and I've come close to death in my own life, I'm also certain that when I'm actually dying, I may feel things I've never known before, never knew my patients were going through. And that's part of the humility to do this work well. So I don't know that we ever get to know this subject until we move through it in our bones, again, in the felt experience of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it certainly does. Well, I really could just sit here all day. This is really fascinating stuff, and I hope you're proud of this project. There's a lot to chew on, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's big stuff, and I'm so grateful to Aronofsky and all the 3 production crews involved and everybody involved in this project. I can see how I'm impressed that it got made. I'm so glad it got made. And it's a tough subject to handle well without accidentally oversimplifying it or overly dramatizing it. And I think the guys did a really beautiful job. So I'm hoping that this piece of work takes society a little closer to this truth so that we're a little less freaked out about it, essentially. And I'm very hopeful that it's going to succeed in that. So we'll soon find out.
Come on, Chris, you giving up already?
Shut up, Gary.